Good afternoon. I'm Bruce Wright, the managing editor of News One, and I'm pleased to be able to bring another installment of the Black Ballot, News One's ongoing conversation bringing attention to important matters for Black America as we get closer to what's being described as the most consequential election in modern history. Today, I have an expert panel to help me discuss on Election Day Eve the urgent topic of voting and the importance of participating in the democratic process, especially this year. But for everyone who has not cast their ballots yet and are planning to head to the polls tomorrow, we need to make sure they're aware of not just their rights, but also a handful of other aspects of voting, as well as the other consequences of not voting. With that said, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists today. First, we have Latasha Brown. She's the co-founder of Black Voters Matter, which advocates for policies to expand voting rights and access and policies that intersect with race, gender, economic, and other aspects of equity. You can follow her organization on Instagram at Black Votes MTR. Next, we have Rukia Lumumba, co-director of the Movement for Black Lives, a coalition of more than 50 groups representing the interests of Black communities across the United States. You can follow her on Instagram at Movement for Black Lives, and that's MVMNT for BLK Lives. Finally, we welcome back Sean Rochester. He's the author of The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. And you can follow him on Instagram at Sean.Rochester. I want to thank you all for being here during a crucial moment in history when you guys could all be doing something else. So we're really grateful you're here. Now, we've only got an hour to cover a ton of topics, so I want to go ahead and get started. Let's talk a little bit about the 11th hour campaigning that we're seeing from Biden and Trump and the significance of not only what they're saying, but who they're saying it to and where they're saying it. The week before the election is crunch time. And so Latasha, I wanted to start with you. If you can discuss, in your opinion, some of the major issues at stake that you'd like to highlight in this election, as well as the campaigning contrast that we've seen from both presidential candidates as they make a play for Black voters in these last few days.
So let me tell you, in 2016, we did not see nearly the kind of headlines that talk about and center Black voters as we've been seeing this year. You know, I think it's really ironic that in the two states that Trump is spending a lot of his time, as both Trump and Biden are Southern states, that currently today, Obama was in Georgia, he was in Florida. Normally that would not happen. They would normally be in other states that were considered swing states. Trump has been to Georgia 3 times this week and has been to Florida several times. What that means is that he's losing ground in the South. And so I'm raising that because I think that's significant that for so many years, the South has been seen as a solid red bloc, and Black voters, the power of Black voters has not been realized and been underinvested. And so what I think what people are, when we're talking to folks on the ground, you know, folks are concerned with COVID-19. Our community has been devastated. We've been hit not only economically, we've been hit health-wise, we've been hit emotionally. It has all kinds of impacts on our communities. Disproportionately, we've seen a number of deaths of people in our community that have resulted from COVID-19 for the lack of leadership in this country. And people are responding to that, and they're frustrated. We also know that this year, at the beginning of the year, with George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, that we saw the largest uprisings ever in this country, all across 50 states that were led primarily by young Black people, people like Rukia Lumumba, who you're going to hear from later, on the Electoral Justice Project and a lot of work that they're doing with Movement for Black Lives. The bottom line is that Black folks have made a clear, I think we've made a clear message that we are frustrated with the ways that things are, that we're demanding accountable leadership, and we want something different. So while this election is one indicator, it's not just this election. This election is a point, a reflection point where we're going to see what I think hundreds and thousands of Black voters stepping up and really getting out to vote, but it's not going to end there. We're going to see a lot of other work because we care about what's happening in our community in the midst of this, what I say is a perfect storm that we're all experiencing right now.
It certainly is a perfect storm. And I wanted to open this question up to the rest of the panel as well. Rukia, do you have any opinion on what you're seeing about from our candidates toward voters in particular? Rukia, can you hear me at all?
I can hear you now. Sorry. Having a little internet trouble. We're out here in Mississippi.
That's totally fine. I just wanted to open the question up to you to get your opinion on the candidates' overtures to Black voters in particular.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I would just like to echo what our great mentor Latasha has stated, is that it's really because of our will and our movement as Black people in this country that candidates are even passionate to us right now, right? And they are making overtures to Black people because they recognize that Black people are going to help decide this election, that we are the biggest part of deciding this election. And not just any Black people, young Black people, old Black, all Black people, right? And especially Southern Black people. In the South, Southern Black people make up a large percent of the population. And so what we see is that people began to recognize this and began to invest time.
I think we're having some connection issues. Rukia, hold that thought if you can hear me. Sean, I also wanted to extend that question to you as well. What's your thought about the play for Black voters that we're seeing from both candidates?
I think you see Biden trying to make, not Biden, Trump trying to make an economic play with his platinum plan, trying to introduce that into the conversation. You have some really famous people that are endorsing the plan or having conversations with him about it. So there's a sense there, I think, from their perspective, as how many people can you draw towards him and maybe away from Biden associated with that. Biden's already had a plan out since the late spring. I don't know if people are as familiar with his plan. More of that conversation is coming up. But the push that I've seen of late is really an economic push to interject some of this into it.
Thanks, Sean. Rukia, I wanted to come back to you. And so Sean was mentioning the platinum plan and endorsements, and we see that endorsements are apparently all the rage in the hip hop community, for instance. And while some of those endorsements are kind of more frivolous and literal money grabs, Rukia, I wanted to ask you, number one, if your organization has endorsed somebody and offered an endorsement, and number two, how much weight do you lend endorsements in an election like this, where lines are clearly drawn in the political stand?
Yeah, so no, we have not issued an endorsement. In the Movement for Black Lives, we don't believe in endorse a particular candidate in the presidential race because we realize that Black people are really concerned about policies that really impact our lives. And so when we're talking about why Black people vote, we know that Black people are voting to ensure harm reduction to the painful policies and practices that have consistently harmed our folks. So we're voting for housing, we're voting for jobs, we're voting for the of earning beyond a living wage. Those are the things that we're looking for. And so we're looking for candidates, those candidates that actually speak to the issues that directly impact our lives. And so, there are some candidates that definitely speak. And so we move people closer to understanding its positions on that. A great place to go to learn about why we're voting is the Vision for Black Lives, which I find on m4bl.org. That's a list, a Black agenda that lists out all of the various issues and also solutions that we believe candidates should take up. And not only take up as candidates for their platform, but when they win on election day, when we see those progressive wins on election day, see them also take up the vision for lives and the policies that we've been pushing. So that's what we do.
Okay, great. And sorry, there's a bad echo. I wanted to also ask the rest of the panel. So we knew, if we're sticking on the topic of endorsements, we knew that Obama would be endorsing Biden. But of course, that doesn't minimize the effects of it and seeing him on the campaign trail. It's pretty inspiring for a lot of folks. But are there any other endorsements that you've noticed that you think actually carry weight that could, that could really turn the tide of an election, perhaps? I'm just wondering, Latasha, if you've seen that. I think you may be muted. Okay. Now I can hear
I'm
you.
sorry. Can you hear me? I think the greatest endorsement is Black voters. That literally, when you see people who have not voted that are now coming to the polls, that's the endorsement. That's the true, real endorsement. We see that there are a couple of folks that are going over, they are skipping over to the White House, and and saying that they're endorsing a candidate. They're outliers. Lil Wayne has a wealth of $150 million. Most of us don't have $150 million in our bank account. I mean, when you look at 50 Cent, the same thing. So really, to be able to exploit the pain of Black folks and to be able to use folks who are in a particular tax bracket to trot them over at the White House ain't nothing new to us. We've seen this over and time again. And those who stand with us, when I'm looking at a campaign and I'm looking who is really giving the endorsements, is when we're out in the street on the community, and then I'm talking to folks saying what it is that they feel. When I'm hearing people saying that they're now going to vote in the election that they didn't want to vote, or they didn't vote in 2016, that's the endorsement that matters. When I hear people are saying, I am going to vote because I think it makes a difference, that's the endorsement that matters. So I'm not trying to minimize and say that those other endorsements don't carry weight. What I am saying, though, is the electorate has changed, that there's a sizable amount of people in our community that are not looking for endorsements. What they are looking for is they're looking for real change. They're looking for who is going to help stop the pain in our community. And so when I'm talking to those folks, that's the endorsements that really carry weight. And so when we were in Texas, in Houston, Texas, we were going in parking lots and grocery stores, and I would meet these brothers and sisters. Before we could get to that car good, we have a sticker up and say, I voted. I was like, okay, that's the endorsement I'm talking about, right? When I went to Family Dollar and there were people that were walking out asking us, I want to register. We're like, well, it's too late for this election cycle, but we want you to register. There's something about the spirit of the people that when the people rise up, right? And when the people decide to endorse candidates, that's where transformative change happens. It's very transactional, the way that we've done politics in this country before, whether it's a labor union or organizations that we respect that have some endorsement. Normally that carries weight with their membership or carries weight with their circles, which is great. That's fine. But I think when we're talking about moving and mobilizing those 45% of the population that are not voting consistently, they're not looking for who endorsed you. What they're looking for is how to see themselves in that policy and that plan, how to stop the pain, reduce the harm, as my sister Rukia said, and literally advance and move our community forward.
Thank you. Okay. All right. I want to stay on the topic of the people. You mentioned the people, and Sean, there's been a ton of talk about the prospects of election violence. Sean, you're not just an expert on economics, but also an expert on race. And so with so much racial division, how much credence do you give this talk about, quote unquote, civil war and election violence at large? What are you seeing?
I think, civil war, 600,000 people, right, died, right? So that's hyperbolic. I think the threat of real violence is a serious thing. Right, there have been people fanning the flames of racial bigotry for years now, and the intensity of it has been growing dramatically under this current administration and over the course of the last year. We've seen public executions, right, of Black people on television. We've seen commentary that seems to be giving credence to really horrific, racialized, violent ideologies and the like. And there are many people who are in pain across the country, and many people often choose to misdirect, that pain onto Black people who tend to be the scapegoats for a lot of this, and also onto Latinos, as well, who tend to be scapegoats. So I would take it extremely seriously. There are anecdotal conversations that people are hearing from people that are within their ecosystem, and then there's also the violence that we've already seen. and people are are acting out. So I think there's real cause for concern there. That's the issue of what happens on November 4th, right? In terms of how people act out. So I think people should, to the extent possible, absolutely vote without question 100%. If you are able to vote, do it 100%. But limit your interaction with folks, and try to protect yourself, as best as possible until there is some alleviation of this, right? There's a tremendous amount of guns within the American kind of community and the like, and then you have people who are feeling empowered to act in violent ways. So yes, I'm concerned about it. I don't know the full extent of it, but I encourage everyone to exhibit caution.
So I do want to, if it's possible, I just want to tap into that as well. And I agree that I do think there's some cause for concern, but I also want to recognize that what racism has a way of doing is it creates fear. Is also a form of voter suppression. The bottom line is we live under the constant threat of violence every single day of our lives in this country, and yet we still rise and we still survive. Now, that doesn't justify what is happening. It doesn't mean we don't need to be concerned. But at the end of the day, when we're looking at, when we see people attack us in this kind of way, that's not the time to shrink back. That's the time where we assert ourselves, that we assert our humanity and our right to defend ourselves and our community. And so I think a lot of what we're seeing is some of this ginning up is to really create this culture of fear and intimidation, hoping that we're going to cower to that. We're not going to cower to that. When they go low, we go hard. Our people have always been under the threat of violence in this country. We have always had to deal with the brunt of racism, and particularly those of us in the dirty South, we know what it looks like. We know what white supremacy looks like. And we also know that our resistance is the only thing that has ever protected us in this process. And so I think it's really important for us to recognize, to be aware, right, to be careful. But I do think that our presence, our collective presence, make a difference. I saw a videotape, just a short video yesterday, where there was a Trump caravan that was escorted by the police that were trying to drive in Fort Worth, Texas. There was a group of brothers that stood in the middle of the street, right, and said, "Oh no, you're not coming into this polling place," to really be able to try to intimidate our folks. And you know what happened? That truck politely turned around. That's what happens when we stand together in our power and protect our communities. We're not going to run from some sense of racism, intimidation. We're actually going to lean into our power. We're going to lean that we're on the side of righteousness, and we're going to fight anybody and stand in any space that tries to seek harm or use those tactics of oppression and of fear against us. Those days are over.
That's right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to add, we're also not going to allow narrative to be put about people that we are the ones inciting, when I consistently play over and over and over and over again. It's violent. In New York, we have an elder, Lil Mutakin, who just got out of prison serving 40 years in prison, signed all of the parole papers that he had to sign to him before he went from the prison. And now we're trying to do him raw, right? Because one of the papers that they gave him to sign was a voter registration form. And so now they're trying to put him back in prison. He's been out for 2 weeks, saying that he's attempting to it's a form of violence. Right? That's a form of violence. It's violence when we have to actually go to the polls in the first place to vote during COVID. We are the people most susceptible to that pandemic, to that virus. Right? That's a form of violence. And so when we talk about violence, let's talk about all forms of violence. And let's recognize that we aren't the violence doers. We're not the aggressors. We're oftentimes the recipients. And we have a right to stand in unity and to protect ourselves. And that's what we're going to do today, tomorrow, and every forward. And we're going to stand by those young people who are going to take the streets, who are going to do whatever is necessary to show that their voice matters.
That's right.
Well, let's stay on this topic for a minute, right? So speaking of election violence, Latasha, voter intimidation, which you just mentioned, has been a huge issue historically in our community. It's taken on new significance during this presidency, and especially this campaign season. So I want to ask all three of you guys, what are some of the key tactics voters should expect? And what are some of the suggested countermeasures? And I want to start with you, Latasha, please.
So, the one thing I want to say, the perfect antidote to voter suppression is overperformance. It's for Black folks to come out and perform at higher rates. You can shut some of that down real quick, right? And so I think that it's really important for us to recognize that one of the big antidotes on voter suppression is the vote turnout. Oftentimes what we see at polling sites, we see long lines, we see people waiting, we see some of the processes breaking down where we feel like if you know that there's going to be 25 machines, why you don't have 25 cords? And so we've seen a constant issue, and when the election is going to happen, right? What we need our people to be armed with at this moment is to know that there are those who are trying to steal this election. And no matter what, you need to stay at the polls, that there's a certain rights that you have, that if you run into any problem around trying to cast your vote, that there is a number that you can call is 1-866-OUR-VOTE. 1-866-OUR-VOTE. Any problem, if you get up there, they say they don't have your name, they don't want to give you a ballot. It is really important for you to do that. We're asking people on tonight, before you go tomorrow, to have you a plan in place to check your status. You can go to our website, blackvotersmatterfund.org, and /vote. You can check your status. You can check where you're supposed to be registered to vote, and you can use that. The second thing is, in many of the polling sites that we're working and others, there will be lawyers and advocates that are at those polling sites. When you get to the polling site, make sure that you realize where the advocates are. If you have any problems, there are a couple of things. One, if you feel any threat of violence, to really be able to intimidate someone at the polling site, that is a federal crime. Do not take that lightly in any way. The first thing to do is to go and notify the election official, right? Secondly, to make sure that you document that, you call that in so that it's documented. The third thing is that you need to make sure that there are folks around you, that what we recognize is that voter intimidation, when there are people, when we show up in our fullness of our presence, right? We see it in a different kind of way. When there are poll workers and poll watchers at the site that know that community, they can actually be able to handle that, especially if they're from that community. And so those are the things that we're asking people to do. Do not engage. There are folks that are going to try to trigger you. Be focused. We're going to go to these polls. We're going to be focused. We're going to go stand in our power. We're going there to be focused to take care of our business. If any moment that we feel any sense of being threatened, that's why you go directly to the poll official, the election officer who is running that site, to report that. As I said, it is a federal crime for anyone to intimidate you at that polling site. In addition to that, make sure that you call 1-866-OUR-VOTE and make sure that you document that.
Excellent. Latasha covered it really, really well and comprehensively, but does anybody have anything they'd like to add to that? Any suggested countermeasures?
I would just add, don't leave without filling out an affidavit ballot. If they offer that at your polling location, make sure you ask to fill out an affidavit ballot. If for some reason your name's not listed, make sure you do that. That's super important, and it can help ensure that your vote is counted at the end of the day.
Okay.
The other thing I just want to offer is, we got these fancy cell phones. We need to record. If there's anything that looks weird or looks out of place, record it on your cell phone. Like, having the evidence, having the documentation helps a lot. That even on tomorrow, it won't be over. And so it's important to really be able to capture those incidents on your cell phone.
And act like you're a legal observer, right? Act in a position where you're trying not to get arrested tomorrow before you vote, right? We want to make sure folks go and get their votes casted. And so if someone bothers you because you might have on a shirt that they don't like and they're trying to tell you can't get in, make sure you record it and just flip your shirt over and walk on in and vote. Like, we are going to handle all of these excuses of why they're trying to prevent you from voting, but let's get you in the door first and make sure that you vote.
That's right.
That's great advice. Great advice. Thank you, guys. And Rukia, I wanted to stay with you. So, this year we've experienced a ton of trauma, right? So we have from Karens to police officers. There's preventable violence against Black people. It's remaining a major issue. strategically, I wondered what you thought about how this informs voters in cities versus those in, say, suburbs or more rural areas that politicians are really bringing attention to.
Yeah, my father used to say, let's not compare plantation to plantation, right? And so the same issues that we have in cities, we oftentimes have in rural communities, and we oftentimes have, especially in suburban communities, especially if you tend to be Black, right? And the issues that we're having is an issue of a system problem. It's the issues of having a rotten system. The system of policing and the system of law enforcement that exists in our country is one that has never recognized the humanity of Black people. And if I can be real, has never recognized the humanity of people, right? Unless you got a lot of money, unless you're a white male. And I think that that's something that we really have to recognize, because we can't continue to rely on these systems of oppression, these systems of policing and violence that harm our communities over and over and over again. And so when you ask me, what do we need in the rural communities? Well, we need the same thing we need in the rural communities that we need in the urban or metropolitan communities. We need healthcare. We need mental health support. We need housing. We need actual support and youth development programs for our children. We need things for them to do. We need a better education system. We need so much more than what we're getting. And so those are the things that we need. And if we have those things, we'll see a happier, healthier environment for all of us. And we'll see that eventually we'll create a new system of justice and a new system of safety that is not based on the current existing policing system that we see today.
It's an interesting approach. In the interest of saving time and hopefully getting to all our questions, I wanted to move on. So I don't want to bring his name up again, but last week we had Lil Wayne, right? He was added to the list of Black folks and celebrities who openly support Donald Trump. But that leads me to how the African community has proven time and time again it's not a monolithic group. Still, many are shocked by the choice. And so, Sean, I wanted to ask you if you could help us unpack why just an anti-racism agenda in the face of a racist president isn't enough to convince Black voters to support anyone but the president.
As you said, we're not a monolithic group, but there's also a tremendous absence of information, really, about policies and plans and programs and a whole host of things. Right? It's hard to really get in the mind of a person like Lil Wayne, for example. But he's a person that says he doesn't experience racial issues himself. Right? He's a person that finds it hard to identify with the issues associated with Black Lives Matter. He's a person that said that when he shot himself as a young person, the Black people around him jumped over his body and ran, and it was a white police officer that looked after him and took him to the hospital and made sure that he was okay. So he may have an affinity, right, to white people or white authority or whatever because of those relationships, right? You have a personal interaction that meant something to you that somehow negates the probably 100 to 200 billion instances of massive, horrific deprivation type actions that various kind of white communities have imposed on the Black communities. But to him, he just knows, and I'm only speculating, what he believes, what he's experienced. Then at a surface level, he can, look at that 2-page plan and say, hey, it's $500 billion, right? That's going to Black people. Hey, we're going to, put 3 million people to work. We've done some stuff to HBCUs, so on and so forth. And that may be very convincing to him, right? And as such, I have no idea if he votes. I have no idea what he's doing within the community to create jobs, business, and provide capital in affordable ways that lead to better health and educational outcomes. You know what I mean? So it may seem, perfectly reasonable from his perspective. The challenge is celebrities bring eyeballs, right, to issues. They bring a lot of eyeballs. I don't know how much capital and resources that they bring, but they bring a lot of eyeballs. And because he's, taken this position, there's a lot more people who are looking at this, right? Now, to what extent will it matter? Really tough to say. A lot of people's minds are made up, right? Already, and have been made up for quite some time. but if you go to the other side, you have a person like, I saw a tweet that said that Jack Nicklaus, right, the golfer, just endorsed Trump, right? Now, before Tiger Woods, he was considered the greatest golfer of all time. You know what I mean? And he's well known in terms of like the upper middle class, wealthier aspects of kind of like the white community. He's engaged in various business ventures. To what extent would that matter, right? To people who are interested in his legacy? I don't know, right? But he's, decided that it was important that he make that kind of position known. So to what extent does celebrity matter? I think in a wave, it doesn't matter at all, right? Where people are fed up and they're excited and they're moving in a particular direction, it won't matter, at all. It very often, the issue becomes, how is this going to play out in swing states? How is it going to play out with young people, right? Who maybe still undecided. And that's a very small group of people from what we're hearing in terms of people who are looking at the polls and kind of running the numbers. And it's really difficult to say. I think it would be better, if folks like that realize the power that they bring, the eyeballs that they bring to a situation, and they could properly articulate why they're making this decision. Right? That they have looked at both plans, they have looked at platforms, they have looked at history and experience, they projected out into the future, and there is some substance, right, behind why they're making this kind of, decision. And very often you don't see that, right? You just see, a tweet, a photo, a picture, and 20 million people kind of being engaged in this kind of conversation with not a lot of information and not a lot of context on top of it.
Yeah, it's really interesting to try to explore that type of mindset and psyche. But I do want to move on. And Latasha, I wanted to ask you, Black women have historically been active voters. We do know this. They've been called the backbone of the Democratic Party. But what other demographics in the Black community are important to capture this election, right? So one side or the other.
If possible, I just want to mention something around the last conversation, because
Sure.
It's easy for us to, and in my own frustration, I got my own frustrations with Lil Wayne and that foolishness. But the truth of the matter is, there's always been an effort of white exploitation of Black pain and Black trauma in this country. And the truth of the matter is, part of the reason why Trump's message is resonating with a certain level of Black men in our community, because on some level they have felt powerless. They felt unseen, they felt unheard, and that's real. And so what winds up happening, there's an exploitation of that. And so I'm raising that because while we have to hold those accountable who are working against, who I don't think are working in our best interest, sometimes they're working, not being informed. Some of them, we just don't have to be honest. Some of them just straight up sell it out. And we just we know what that is. We just got to be honest and claim that's what it is. It's for their own individual benefit. And I don't like my brother. I don't know what was in his mind. What I do know is we ain't seen Lil Wayne all year. Right? He hasn't said anything. Now all of a sudden he care about politics because he over in a red, white, and blue sweater that he got from Polo or somewhere at the White House, but we ain't seen that brother. And so fundamentally, that makes me think that he's not really serious about that. But aside from that, I do think that the larger issue is that there is a certain level of discontent in our community because politics has failed us on so many levels. And that is real. And so there's an exploitation, I think, that the Trump campaign, which even makes it that much more insidious and evil, that if you know that Black men are hurting, if you know that Black men have been feeling abandoned by the system, that if you know that Black men are seeking resources, where your platinum plan been for the last 4 years? Why is not 80% of Black business not getting resources? Why you ain't show up? Where you been? Right? And so that means that you have been fully aware of the pain that our community has used. And the only thing that you see in it is how can you exploit it so that you can literally propel yourself. Because he's certainly shown that he doesn't have an interest in our community and our people. So, but aside from that, as we're talking about Black women, and I raise this because I do think that there's this narrative that Black men, and let me be clear, that even if Trump secures 10% of black men, that means 90% of black men are literally going against Trump. Right, so to actually create this narrative as if black men and black men are standing with Trump is simply not true. It is false. Matter of fact, there's not another constituency group outside of black women in this country that are voting on that level of block. So black men are standing with black women. There's a couple of outliers, but you can't save them all, but so ultimately, I do think that when we're talking about black women and the role of black women, I think that we have been on the vanguard. I don't think it's just new. I think we've always been on the vanguard because we see ourselves in many ways as protectors. We see ourselves as nurturers of our children, of our families, even of our men. Y'all, part of what we saw even in the civil rights movement, right, is you saw a lot of those stories were lifting up the legacy of the men. But if you really get down to who was organizing and doing the work, it was sisters. But there was something about even black women wanting to see black men flourish in particular space and the leadership, lift up the leadership. And so I think this is a moment right now that we need our brothers to stand with us, that this is a moment in an era that black women are standing in our power and in leadership. And we have always consistently been loyal to our communities. And so we are going to say, we're not going to let anybody divide us. Brothers and sisters are standing together in this space. And so we have to acknowledge that. So I always push back on this narrative because it seeks to divide us because there may be some differences, right? There may be some differences. What is that, a 6-point difference? But 90% of folk are with us. So at the end of the day, I think it's really important for us to stay centered and focus and that we control the narrative, that black folk in this country, there's not another political base, constituency base that votes in alignment in a political bloc like black folks in America.
That's a fair
right.
and definitely necessary distinction. I want to move on to Rukia. I wanted to ask you, so a lot of attention is being given to the presidential election, rightfully so, but obviously there are a number of other crucial down ballot elections with major consequences. And people often get to the ballot box and are shocked by how many positions are actually up for election locally. I wonder can you do a quick overview of some of the key offices folks will, likely see on the ballot and what roles they play and how necessary they are?
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with the Senate race because I'm in Mississippi. And right now we have Mike Espy running against Cindy Hyde-Smith. And we know that that is an extremely important election here in Mississippi. Because it will be the first time in a long time that we've had a black senator. It'll be the first time, actually, that we've had a black senator. The other thing is that we also have judicial races that are happening right now. Judicial races that includes Mississippi Supreme Court justices. We got Latrice Westbrook running against another person, Kenneth Griffiths. And this is the first time that a black woman is running for a Supreme Court justice position. And so when you're looking down ballot, you'll see Senate races, you'll see congressional races where you can vote for your House of Representative. You'll also see things on like ballot initiatives. So in many states, it might be your first time having medical marijuana on the ballot. In some states, it might be your first time, like us in Mississippi, we're voting on a new state flag. So there'll be a number of things on the ballot, but the most important seats that you'll see are, the presidential, the vice president, the Senate, the Congress, and you'll see some really key judicial races that people don't pay attention to. We elect judges, y'all, and they determine who is prosecuted. They determine laws and policies in our communities. So we have some power there to change and transform some systems. Well,
thanks, Rukia. And Sean, speaking of the Senate that Rukia mentioned, control of the Senate is also at stake. Republicans are controlling the Senate now, but they're also the same body that's currently delaying the passage of a stimulus bill that would really provide financial relief to a lot of citizens who need it as record unemployment lingers. So, Sean, I wanted to ask you if you could discuss the importance of those Senate races in particular on Election Day.
Yeah, they're clearly massively important because you need to have alignment between the House and the Senate, as well as the president, to get legislation through that can best serve your interests. I think the numbers are something like 80% of people vote straight down the ballot across party lines, right? Don't leave anything unaddressed. Express the power of your vote for the candidates who are, on the ballot without question. I think one of the things that are really important here is to what extent are Black economic interests going to be served, right? When all indications are, and who knows what can actually wind up happening, and people should vote with no matter what, right? Is that it's likely that Biden could win, right? It's also certainly possible that the Democrats may gain control of the Senate. That would be a powerful alignment to get lots of important legislation through. And it is vitally important that the Democrats understand that Black economic interests must be addressed, right? If things work out such that they take control and have that level of alignment, it will not last for long. You typically have, until the midterm elections, then you'll have a switch that's happening. There is no more consistent nor loyal voter in this country than the Black voter, and the Black voter has been such for 60 years. It is a level of consistency, right, at an extraordinarily high level that is unequaled and unparalleled. And what we need to see are policies that are put in place and legislation that creates jobs, businesses, and provide capital within the Black community, organized in such a way that it drives better health and educational outcomes. These policies need to be specific to the Black community. They need to be economic without question, and they need to be scalable, because the challenges that we are facing are massive, right? We have to stop with people putting $1,000 investments into $1 million problems, $1 million investments into $1 billion problems, and $1 billion investments into $1 trillion gaps, right? That needs to be 100% clear. There is a relationship between the voter and the representative. Black people have been consistent and true in that relationship. The same cannot be said of representatives of Black interests, and that needs to stop.
Thanks, Sean. Latasha, I want to come back to you. I want to talk about voters, in particular early voters. So there have been a record number of people who have already voted early, but there's still the troubling, lingering statistic of undecided voters, something we mentioned earlier, despite the candidates presenting clear differences between their platforms. Latasha, you've been at the front lines of voting advocacy for years now. First, have you encountered any undecided voters this year? And two, if they're watching this panel right now, what do you tell undecided voters just on the day right before Election Day?
I have encountered undecided voters. I've encountered some voters who are very troubled with the choices, that are not excited by either candidate for some legitimate reasons. And so part of what we think is a part of the problem around democracy in this country anyway is that we've made it be too candidate and party centered. That fundamentally what is happening is we're waiting for the best candidate to come forward that is going to save us there's not going to be a candidate to save us. We're going to save us. We need a candidate that we can put in the office that will carry out our agenda in which we have developed, that we've set the priorities. To be able to do that, we have to organize ourselves. And so part of what I've been talking to people, as I've been talking to folks, is that we also have to see voting as a tactical strategy. That people, I've heard folks often say, well, I don't want to be able to choose. I don't see any candidate is not someone that I'm excited about. Well, I'm not voting for my friend. So whether I like you or not is not it's not my interest. I'm like Drake. I don't need no new friends, right? What I am voting for is a tactical strategy. When I'm considering a couple of things, I always consider three things. The first thing is I consider not on my tax bracket or who I am. I always vote for the most vulnerable in my community. Who is going to be the best that's going to support the most vulnerable in my community? Because I know that if you take care of the most vulnerable in our community, then all of us will have some level of protection. That's number one. Number two, I'm often looking at somebody's going to win. It's kind of like in the championship. Your team may not make it to the championship, but one of them gonna win this year. Somebody are gonna win the Super Bowl. And the question is, which team, right, better aligns with that you can deal with if your team hasn't made it. And so fundamentally, I think it's really important for us to vote based on tactical strategy. The third thing too is my piece of telling people who to vote is, I'm not asking you to vote for a political candidate. I'm not necessarily asking you at this moment to vote for a party, but I am asking you to vote for you. And what I mean by that is fundamentally that there are going to be decisions and policies that are made that impact our people. We already see that with COVID-19, how we have been devastated, how our businesses have been left out, that we have not gotten the stimulus dollars. Someone is going to make a decision of how we go forward as we're looking at a really difficult road ahead, I think, in terms of recovery of COVID-19. And so we've got to make a tactical decision on what is the best choice that one will reduce the harm to our community, what candidate that we can have some level of influence of possibly shaping the work that we do. And then the third thing is, what space are we going to give us grace and space as we're organizing for now so that we can have better, we have better options in the future. That fundamentally what we have to deal with what is before us now. We don't need to create these false equivalencies like, oh, it's just a Democrat and a Republican. We're running against fascism right now. Let's be clear. When you say, those of us in the Deep South, we know racism, but we also know white supremacy. They're not the same. While they may come out of the same space, they're not the same. And so anyone that aligns themselves with white supremacists as a Black woman growing up in the South, you have automatically disqualified yourself, because on the art of that white supremacy is genocide. Those are the folks who have went around this country, traumatized us, have killed us, are lined up with the police saying that it's okay to shoot an unarmed man in the back, to kill a man with his neck. No, I can't stand with you. Right? It doesn't matter. If there's no tax break in the world you can give me that would actually outweigh the danger and the insecurity that white supremacists brings to my people. And so I think in this election, we need to be clear about what it is that we're voting for. We have to vote for ourselves, the protection of our community, and how we move forward as we also build better alternatives so that we can have a difference and shift this entire political paradigm.
That's right.
Yeah, and speaking of that, that brings me to the fact that this year has been filled with protesting, a pandemic, and really a lot of pain. People are emotionally exhausted, and there's still plenty of work to do regardless of who wins. And so, Rukia, I wanted to ask you if you could discuss what's the strategic work, I guess, that we need immediately following Election Day and beyond?
Yeah, that's an easy question. But I will say this before I answer that, is that Latasha was right about everything she just said. And one thing that our sister Nalini Stamps says and sings oftentimes, she says, the people will rise, right? With the Working Families Party, she says, the people will rise, the people will rise. But what we've seen is people rising all year long. And not just all year. We've seen people rising since they literally choked Eric Garner to death, right? Since they shot Sean Bell 11 times. When they harmed and hurt all of the folks that we've seen over decades. We're not talking about just this year. We're talking about decades of modern day lynchings. And so, our people are ready. Our people are rising, and it's being led by young people. And so I think what we want to see and what we have to see the day after, and what people are already organizing around, is what is our next step. And our next step is to continue to organize, because we were taught, Fannie taught us, right? Fannie taught us to vote and organize, not one or the other. We got to do both. And so the day after elections, we don't stop there. We engage in more community-led opportunities of governance. We actually bring democracy back to our people, and we engage in people's assemblies and other tools that allow us to consistently, day after day after day, engage in the policy and practice of creating policies and practices, right? That actually allow us as residents to actually engage in the political process in a real way, where the people we represented are the people we elected to represent us are no longer just representing us and taking and making laws for us, but instead they're actually our delegates that we're telling this is the law, this is the policy that we want to see implemented, and then they're implementing it. And so that's about engaging in that hard work, which means that's campaigning all year round. That means that we're engage in civic engagement in our political decision-making process, just like we brush our teeth, that it becomes so normal to our people, that our people are so educated, They're so motivated and we're so organized that we're actually really taking policy and practice and power into our own hands and deciding how we're going to be governed on a local basis.
Thanks, Rukia. And I want to open this question up to our other two panelists, beginning with Sean, and then Latasha, if you can answer that as well. But what is the strategic work, in your opinion, that we need immediately following Election Day?
As you know, like I talk about this PhD economic framework, right? Purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that create jobs and businesses and provide, capital to the Black community, right? Jobs, business, capital, organized in such a way that it produces better health and educational outcomes. So, in the first 100 days or so, what are they doing to execute on this platinum plan, not platinum, this, lift every voice and sing plan, right? If Biden happens to be in there, to drive economic impact for Black people. How quickly can they get the incentives for up to $15,000 for down payment on new homes? How quickly can they get the incentives for the providing of low income housing within the Black community in particular and other low income communities, in general? To what extent are they going to have Black enterprise engaged in the construction, right, of those housing and the jobs associated with it? What are they going to be doing to provide capital and liquidity for Black enterprise and for getting more contracts from a government standpoint? We are missing, pre-COVID, Black people was missing over 6 million jobs across the broader Black community. We're missing 1.4 million businesses with employees. There's about 110,000 of those, and trillions of dollars across the across our collective balance sheet. We own about 2% of U.S. wealth. Like, what policies and plans are being put in place to close these gaps in a meaningful, material, transformative, and measurable way? People's ability to discriminate against you is proportional to the amount of capital that you have, and Black people have, by design, the least amount of capital. Poor people get what rich people think they deserve and not a nickel more, right? We need to be addressing the jobs gap issue. We need to be addressing the issue associated with unemployment and underemployment and the wage gap that exists between Black people, Black men, and Black women and their white peers. We're losing, according to Citigroup, $2.7 trillion was lost over the last 20 years from Black workers just on the wage gap. The vast majority of that associated with Black women. It's $135 billion a year. Like, what policies, plans are put in place for that? We're missing about 352,000 Black teachers across the greater K through 12 system. That's about $20 billion a year of income that is not going to Black communities because those teachers, are not there and are not in place, right? We have the issue associated with the joblessness with people who are incarcerated and people who are formerly incarcerated who can't get the employment that they need, who have families nonetheless and important members of the community. They've done their time, they've paid their debts to society, but then they're carrying this for the remainder of their life, and the entire community, including their children, is paying for it. Like, Black people are consistent. They rise up, as was said by my fellow panelists. They are focused and dependable, and they do not get economic resources according to their level of commitment. And that needs to stop, right? Regardless of the party that's in place. The Black voter is being and has been taken for granted. Nobody's getting anywhere unless you have Black people showing up in unimaginable numbers, right? So we need to have, what economic policies are really being put in place? What are they going to do to address the fact that $23 billion more is going to white kids in predominantly white communities than Black kids for the same kind of school system and the same career? Every year this is occurring. Like, what is being done to address that? What is being done to make sure that opportunity zones actually really work for Black people? What is going to be done to make sure that the Community Reinvestment Act is actually working for Black people? What is going to be done to make sure that CDFIs, right, these institutions are going to be providing liquidity for Black people in particular, right? We have to deal with the fact that you have high levels of anti-Black bias that affect how resources are distributed. And Black issues get converted into minority issues, and that becomes very dilutive and problematic, right? We need policies that are very consistent. Now, They both talk about they have a plan for Black America. We need to see that executed on day one with a laser focus. And as was said by my fellow panelists, the real work, not just the real work, it starts on November 4th, right? Do not go home and be like, you're done, mission accomplished, no matter what side you are picking. You are not done. It is just beginning. People need to be held accountable, right? They need to be told what your interests are, right? You need to provide guidance. You need to hold their feet to the fire, and you need to be organizing for the next 4 years. You need to be engaged in the midterm. You need to be engaged in all your local elections, right? And you need to position yourself properly so that you can maximize the ask. This is a transactional relationship. It's very difficult to ask for things when the moment has passed, right? And our positioning is often suboptimal. So that's one of the things I just want to reiterate. It is not done on November 4th. Do not go home and be like, mission accomplished. I'll see you next 4 years. People continually do that. It is putting your community at perilous risk. Please do not do that.
Thank you, Sean. I just want to give a couple of minutes. We only have a couple of minutes left, but to let us know what she thought about what the strategic work is that we need immediately following Election Day.
So I think Rukia and Sean have said, the bulk of what the work, we have to organize and we also have to work on a policy agenda. But I also want to push a third piece, and that while we certainly need money, right, and we need an economic stimulus package, that fundamentally, even right now, if every single Black person got a PhD and $1 million, it would take us 200 years to close the wealth gap, that we've got to seriously think about alternatives around shifting the wealth and redistributing the wealth in the system, like reparations, that we also have to think and be Black futurists, that not just to keep responding to what it is that exists now, that I'm hoping that we do two things. That one, we use this moment, this transactional moment, to take care of the business around thinking about policy, but we also even go further and start thinking about the transformative moments, that fundamentally every single system in this country has been rooted in structural racism and will continue to have us at a disadvantage unless we restructure that. And so we've got to really push ourselves to radically reimagine what this nation could be that literally centers humanity and the citizens of this country, including Black people.
And we can do that in two ways. The first 100 days, please. We can, one, pass the BREATHE Act. Go to breatheact.org. Let's transform the system of public safety. And we can pass the Red, Black, and Green New Deal. Because climate change and environmental justice is real in our communities, and we are the hardest hit. So those are two other things that can be passed immediately, day one.
Thank you, guys. We have to end here. I want to thank our panelists for joining me today in this important conversation. Latasha Brown, she's a co-founder of Black Voters Matter. Rukia Lumumba, she's a co-director of the Movement for Black Lives. And Sean Rochester, he's the author of The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. Thank you guys again. And quickly, I'd like to close by paying tribute to my late father, Judge Bruce Wright. He's the author of Black Robes, White Justice. And he once said, quote, "Non-voting is a fruitless temper tantrum." Decades later, those 7 words remain painfully relevant. And so I just would like to encourage all our viewers and everybody listening to go ahead and please vote. In the meantime, follow us on Facebook here at News One, Twitter at News One, and on Instagram at News1_official. And I'd like to thank our panelists again for joining me. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to a very eventful Election Day. You guys have a nice evening.
Thank you.
You too. Thank you.